Hey there everybody, welcome to another carving video. So in this one, I'm going to be talking about how as a new carver, you're able to determine if your gouges are sharp enough to carve efficiently with a gouge test. I'll also touch on if the gouges are not sharp. I'll talk about how you can determine whether they need to be honed or whether they need to be sharpened. This was like one of the biggest things that I struggled with when I first started carving. I had no idea what I was doing, and oftentimes I went to a sharpening stone when all I needed to do was to hone. So in this video, I'm going to be covering that. The test is actually very simple. For a gouge to be performing at a high level efficiently, it should be able to cut perpendicular to the grain or across the grain of softwoods like pine or basswood. It should be able to cut through that really like butter with very little to no resistance. So in my example, I'm going to be using a piece of pine wood because that's the type of wood that I frequently carve with. So I'm going to show you an example of a gouge that is carving efficiently and then a gouge that is not. Okay, so here's the good gouge. Now I'm kind of using a slight technique. I'm not pushing it just straight, I'm giving it a little slice as I go, which is fine. But as you can see while I'm carving this, it's carving smooth and there's very little wood, I guess, pushing as the cut is going through the wood. It's just nice and smooth, like there may be a few spots, but for the most part, it's very consistent, smooth, little resistance to no resistance. There's very little tearing in the actual wood grain. So this is one that is not necessarily performing and should probably be touched up with either some honing or maybe some sharpening. So when I push this through the wood, I'm giving it a little slight rotation, and it's not the exact same sweep number and width, but the principle is the same. The signs in the wood is the same throughout. And so with this one, you can clearly see that there's some pushing of the grain here. So that was a little bit better of a cut, but it shouldn't be. It should be consistent. Okay, so in this one there's a little pushing or breaking of the grain as the cut goes through, and you can feel as you're cutting resistance here and there. So here's the good gouge again, and that's very smooth, little resistance, and the wood sign is good. So here's maybe a little bit better view of the gouge strokes. Again, these were very good, clean, and then these you can see within the stroke, they're like micro gaps within the grain, which would indicate that the grain was pushed by the cutting edge instead of cut by the cutting edge. So some things to consider when doing the test is that it's not an absolute. Like I said, it's a great test for beginners, that they can do the test immediately when they get their new gouges to see if they're ready to carve right out of the box or if they need to be addressed. But there are a few variables that need to be thought about. There maybe are some gouges out there that are made a little bit different. They've got a thicker bevel, or they've got maybe a steeper angled bevel, which would kind of change the perspective on this test. So you have to keep that in mind. But I would say the vast majority of the gouges out there that are available to purchase are primarily for like softer woods, or they're fairly consistent bevel wise, like the files and the beaver crafts, shafts, those types of common gouges that generally newer carvers are buying. The test is definitely more of it's kind of a combination between a feel and a visual. The visual is perfect for, like I said, the newer carvers, so they can visually see on their wood something is wrong. But it's also a feel, because if the gouge feels smooth going through the wood, it might not be necessary to spend all this extra time to hone and to sharpen to get that perfectly smooth cut if the gouge is already feeling good through the wood, but there may be a few micro gaps indicating pushing of the wood. That could indicate maybe a tighter spot in the grain, or maybe a knot underneath that you didn't necessarily see. So those are some things that need to be considered when doing the test. So now the question is, does my gouge need to be honed or does it need to be sharpened? And the first thing I do when I see that my gouge is not performing properly is I look at the cutting edge of the gouge. If there is a visual nick or some type of imperfection on the cutting edge of my gouge, then that needs to be sharpened. A hone is not going to fix an imperfection on the edge. That will need to be taken to a sharpening stone, and you're going to have to file back the cutting edge down to the bottom of that nick to where it's no longer visible, it's gone. And then you're going to have to go through the process of sharpening and then honing. If there is no visible nick or imperfection on my edge, then I generally hone. The good rule of thumb from my perspective, again, it's different for everybody. It depends on how hard you are with your gouges. It just depends on the individual carver. But for me, I would probably say that I hone 90% of the time and I sharpen 10% of the time. I still have gouges on my wall here that I have never sharpened, like not even once. They've been here for years. I use them fairly frequently, but yet I've never had to sharpen them. Like if you are carving more harder woods, like your oaks and maples and walnuts and stuff, you're probably going to run into some more issues with your gouges more frequently. You're probably going to be hurting the edge a little bit more if you're more of a hardwood carver. But softwoods, that type of wood is fairly decent, and it doesn't hurt the gouges super bad unless you're very rough with your gouges. So after you go through all of that, the next question, okay, so I've honed a ton and I'm still not getting a good clean stroke through the wood. Then if you've done that, my next thought would be either your honing techniques are not correct or it needs to be touched up with the sharpening stone. But I would assume that if that was the case, it would be a very minor issue that like a very fine grit would probably take care of, or like a super fine. Like you wouldn't need to start from the roughest grit and then work your way back up. So like I said, if you're running into that issue, either it's your honing and sharpening techniques are a little bit off or something like that. And that's a good time to experiment with some different equipment, honing equipment, sharpening equipment. I personally have had a lot of success with just a block of wood and some honing compound. I found that was easier and I got a better edge honing that way versus a leather strop. And then regarding the sharpening stones, I did not have good success with a wet stone. You can get those online, but I found that diamond stones worked far better for me. They were a lot easier to use. That's kind of what your next task would be, is if you're having some of those issues, you're gonna have to kind of dive in and figure out what's going on, whether it's your techniques or your equipment, something like that. And I'm not going to specifically go over proper honing techniques or sharpening techniques in this video. This was basically just to explain the test for new carvers, so then they're able to identify whether their gouges are good to go or not. Otherwise, that's all I got in this video. So if you have any questions or suggestions, you can let me know in the comments below. Thanks.